Kansas City smelled like rain and cigarette smoke on the 3rd of March, 1963. Inside the Memorial Hall auditorium, 3,000 people packed the seats for a benefit concert honoring Cactus Jack McCall, the local DJ who'd championed country music when nobody else would touch it. The stage lights caught the sequins on Patsy Cline's dress as she finished her final number, voice hitting notes that seemed impossible for a human throat to produce. She was 30 years old. At the peak of everything she'd fought for since she was a kid, singing in her mother's Virginia kitchen. Backstage, Patsy kicked off her heels and lit a cigarette. Her feet ached, her throat felt raw. But the crowd noise still echoed through the concrete walls, and that sound never got old. Randy Hughes, her manager and pilot, leaned against a dressing room doorframe, flight jacket already on. He checked his watch for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. "We need to move," Randy said. "Weather's turning." Patsy looked at him through cigarette smoke. "How bad?" "Cold front pushing down from Iowa. We get ahead of it. We're fine." She'd heard Randy say that before. He had 400 hours of flight time, which sounded like a lot until you understood what it meant. He'd earned his pilot's license only 18 months ago, flew a Piper Comanche 250 that he'd bought with money from managing her career. The plane had the registration number November 7000 Papa painted on its tail. Patsy had flown with him maybe a dozen times, never loved it, never said anything because Randy took pride in that plane the way other men took pride in sports cars. Cowboy, Copas, and Hawkshaw Hawkins, 2 other performers on the bill, stood in the hallway arguing with their wives. Copas wanted to fly back with Randy. His wife wanted him on a commercial flight the next morning. Hawkshaw sided with the wives. Dottie West, who'd also performed that night, already had her bags packed for a bus ride home. "Your boy Randy's sick," Patsy's friend Loretta reminded her. "Doctor said watch him close." Patsy stubbed out her cigarette. Randy Jr. was 4 years old, had a cough that wouldn't quit. The pediatrician in Nashville wanted to see him again Tuesday morning. Flying meant she'd be home by midnight. Bus meant she wouldn't see her son until Wednesday afternoon at the earliest. "We'll beat the weather," Randy Hughes said again. The Fairfax airport sat on the Missouri side of the river, small and mostly empty that Sunday afternoon. A guy named Everett, who worked the weather station, walked out to the tarmac as Randy did his pre-flight check. Everett carried a clipboard with satellite data that showed the cold front accelerating, expected to hit central Tennessee around 6 p.m. "You're cutting it close," Everett said. Randy ran his hand along the Comanche's wing. "We'll be in Nashville by 5:30. Everett looked at the clouds building on the northern horizon. Didn't say anything else. Weather guys learned not to argue with pilots who'd already made up their minds. Patsy climbed into the passenger seat. Cowboy, Copas, and Hawkshaw Hawkins squeezed into the back. The engine coughed twice before catching. Randy taxied to the runway, got clearance, pushed the throttle forward. The Comanche lifted at 1:13 p.m. Patsy watched Kansas City shrink beneath them. Thought about Randy Jr.'s cough. Thought about the show she had booked next week. Thought about anything except the fact that she hated small planes. The last radio transmission from November 7000, Papa, came at 6:07 p.m. Randy reported passing Dyersburg, Tennessee, said they'd be landing in Nashville within 30 minutes. Air traffic control acknowledged. Then, nothing but static. The silence came first. Air traffic control in Nashville expected Randy Hughes to check in again around 6:20 p.m. Standard procedure when a pilot crossed into their airspace. The controller on duty, a man named Walter who'd worked that tower for 11 years, waited 5 minutes past the expected call, then 10. At 6:35 he tried raising November 7000 Papa on the radio, got nothing back except the hollow buzz of dead air. Walter called his supervisor. The supervisor called the Civil Aeronautics Board. The CAB said wait until 7 p.m. before declaring an emergency. Pilots sometimes lost radio contact. Happened more than people wanted to admit. 7 p.m. came and went. Charlie Dick, Patsy's husband, stood in their Madison, Tennessee home with the phone pressed against his ear, talking to someone at the airport who kept saying the same useless words. Delayed. Weather. Probably landed somewhere to wait out the storm. Charlie hung up and looked at his son, Randy Jr., asleep on the couch with a blanket tucked around his small body. The kid's breathing sounded wet and labored. Charlie picked up the phone again, called everyone he could think of who might know something. Nobody knew anything. 90 miles southwest of Nashville, in a rural stretch of Tennessee hill country outside Camden, a farmer named Wade Odell sat in his living room, listening to the wind hammer against the windows. The cold front had arrived exactly when the Weather Service predicted, bringing freezing rain and gusts that bent the bare trees nearly horizontal. Wade's wife Helen was reading a magazine when they both heard it, a sound that didn't belong to wind or thunder. A low, tearing noise followed by impact that rattled the dishes in their kitchen cabinets. "That was a plane," Wade said. Helen looked up from her magazine. "You sure?" "I'm sure." Wade pulled on his coat and boots, grabbed a flashlight, walked out into the storm. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in 2 hours. Rain turned to sleet that stung his face like thrown gravel. He swept the flashlight beam across his property, across the dark tree line that separated his land from the Hollis family's farm next door. Saw nothing. The wind killed sound, made it impossible to tell which direction the noise had come from. Wade stood there for 10 minutes, soaked through, then went back inside, called the sheriff's office in Camden, told them what he'd heard. The deputy who answered said they'd received 3 other calls about possible aircraft sounds, but search and rescue wouldn't launch until morning. Nobody flew search patterns in weather like this. Too dangerous. Morning came cold and clear. The storm had passed, leaving ice coating every surface. The Civil Aeronautics Board organized search teams at first light, dispatching spotter planes to sweep the flight path between Dyersburg and Nashville. Randy Hughes had filed a flight plan that put him over Interstate 40, the main route that cut through that part of Tennessee. The searchers focused there first, found nothing, expanded the search radius, still nothing. Wade Odell didn't wait for official search teams. He walked his property at dawn, following an instinct he couldn't name. Found debris 300 yards from his house, scattered across a wooded hillside, pieces of metal, fabric, a seat cushion hanging from a tree branch. He stopped walking, stood very still, saw more wreckage ahead, a trail of destruction that led deeper into the woods. Wade turned around, ran back to his house, called the sheriff again. By 9 a.m. on March 5th, the hillside swarmed with law enforcement, cabbie investigators and journalists who'd monitored the police radio and arrived before anyone could establish a perimeter. Sheriff Vernon Boggs tried to control the scene, but the damage was done. Photographers had already captured images that would appear in newspapers across the country. The wreckage was spread across an area roughly 300 yards in diameter. The Piper Comanche had hit the ground at a steep angle, disintegrating on impact. Investigators found the 4 bodies scattered outside the main debris field. Patsy Cline lay 50 feet from where the cockpit had come to rest. Her wristwatch, a silver bulova her husband had given her for their anniversary, had stopped at exactly 6:20 p.m. A journalist named Marlene Shaw from the Nashville Tennessean stood at the edge of the crash site taking notes. She'd covered plane crashes before. This one looked different. The debris pattern suggested the aircraft had been in a steep, uncontrolled descent, not a glide, not an attempt at emergency landing. Something had gone catastrophically wrong very quickly. Marlene watched investigators tag evidence, photograph angles, measure distances. One of them, a cab inspector named Morris, crouched next to a section of the instrument panel. He studied the altimeter, made notes on his clipboard, looked up at the trees surrounding the crash site. "What do you see?" Marlene called out. Morris didn't answer. Sheriff Boggs stepped between them, told Marlene she needed to move back behind the tape line. She moved back, kept watching. Saw Morris examine the altimeter again, then shake his head like he'd discovered something he didn't want to find. The preliminary CABI report came out 3 days later. Cause of accident: pilot error due to spatial disorientation in adverse weather conditions. Randy Hughes had likely become confused in the storm, lost track of his altitude, and flown into the ground while believing he was still safely above terrain. The report noted that Hughes had limited instrument flight experience, recommended additional training requirements for private pilots. Case essentially closed pending final investigation. Charlie Dick read the report in his kitchen, while his son coughed in the next room. Read it twice, couldn't make himself believe it. Randy Hughes was careful, maybe not the most experienced pilot, but he checked weather, filed flight plans, followed procedures. Charlie thought about that last radio transmission. Randy's voice had sounded normal, not panicked, not confused. Just a pilot reporting his position and expected arrival time. Something didn't fit. Charlie folded the report, put it in a drawer, started making phone calls to people who knew more about aviation than he did. The pattern started becoming visible to people who paid attention. February 3rd, 1959, a Beechcraft Bonanza went down in an Iowa cornfield during a winter storm, killing Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and J.P. Richardson, known to his fans as the Big Bopper. 3 rising stars, all under 30, all killed in a single night that people would start calling the day the music died. The official report blamed pilot error and weather conditions. Roger Peterson, the pilot, had limited instrument training, flew into a storm he shouldn't have been flying in. That explanation satisfied most people. Accidents happened. Small planes were dangerous. April 17, 1960, Eddie Cochran died in a taxi crash near Chippenham, England. He was 21 years old, had just finished a tour, was heading to the airport to fly home. The taxi blew a tire at high speed, hit a lamppost. Eddie wasn't wearing a seatbelt, thrown from the vehicle. Died hours later from head trauma. Again, the explanation seemed straightforward. Bad luck. Wrong place, wrong time. But Eddie had been in the middle of contract negotiations with his label, arguing over royalties and creative control. Friends said he'd been talking about starting his own production company, cutting out the middlemen who took most of his earnings. Now Patsy Cline. March 5, 1963. Same type of scenario, small plane, bad weather, pilot error. Another star gone at the peak of their career. And the pattern wouldn't stop there. July 31st, 1964, just 16 months after Patsy's death, Jim Reeves would climb into his single-engine Beechcraft Debonair during a thunderstorm near Nashville. Jim was Patsy's friend, had flown with Randy Hughes multiple times, knew the same routes, faced the same pressures from the same industry. His plane would crash in almost identical circumstances, wreckage scattered across wooded Tennessee hills, bodies found outside the aircraft, no distress call, just silence, then impact. The Grand Ole Opry, that legendary stage in downtown Nashville, where country music royalty performed every weekend, became a place where people whispered about curses and conspiracies. Dottie West, who'd shared the bill with Patsy that night in Kansas City and chosen to take a bus instead of flying, sat in her dressing room 3 weeks after the crash, talking to a young singer named Loretta Lynn. Dottie chain-smoked, hands shaking slightly as she described Randy Hughes's behavior that Sunday afternoon. He was in a hurry, Dottie said. Not normal hurry, like he had a deadline, like someone was waiting for him and he couldn't be late. Loretta asked what she meant. Dottie stubbed out her cigarette, lit another one immediately. Said Randy had made 3 phone calls from the venue office before the show ended. Private calls with the door closed. When he came out, he was pale, agitated, kept checking his watch. Told everyone they were leaving right after Patsy's set. No time for the after-party, no time for anything. Who was he calling? Loretta asked. Dottie shook her head. Nobody knows. Phone records disappeared. Venue said they don't keep logs that detailed. The financial side of Patsy's career added another layer of strangeness. She'd recently switched from Decca Records to a more favorable contract that gave her greater control over her recordings and a larger percentage of royalties. The old contract, signed when she was young and desperate for any deal, had been bleeding her dry for years. Owen Bradley, her producer, had opposed the move, said she was being ungrateful, said she didn't understand how the business worked. Patsy told friends she understood exactly how it worked, and that was the problem. She'd discovered discrepancies in her royalty statements. Money that should have been paid, but somehow never arrived. Publishing rights assigned to shell companies she'd never heard of. A woman named Lenora, who worked in the accounting department at Decca, had helped Patsy document the irregularities. Compiled folders of contracts, payment records, correspondence that showed a pattern of systematic exploitation. Patsy planned to use those documents in her negotiations. 3 days after her death, Lenora's office was burglarized. Only Patsy's files were taken, nothing else. Lenora quit the music industry 2 months later, moved to Oklahoma, refused to talk about what happened. Charlie Dick tried to get access to Patsy's financial records after her death, wanted to understand what money she'd earned, what debts remained, what his children would inherit. The label's lawyers sent him boxes of paperwork so dense and convoluted that it would have taken a forensic accountant months to untangle. Charlie hired a lawyer. The lawyer spent 6 weeks reviewing documents, then told Charlie the records were incomplete. Whole sections missing, payments referenced in correspondence that had no supporting documentation. Charlie asked what that meant. The lawyer said it meant someone didn't want anyone looking too closely at where Patsy's money had gone. Meanwhile, mechanics who'd worked on Randy Hughes' Piper Comanche started talking. A guy named Clyde, who operated a small maintenance shop at John Tune Airport, where Randy kept his plane, told a reporter from the Nashville Banner that the Comanche had come in for an emergency inspection 2 days before the Kansas City trip. Clyde wouldn't specify what the problem was, said Randy, made him sign a non-disclosure agreement, which was unusual for routine maintenance. The Banner ran a small story buried on page 9. Nobody followed up. Investigators from the Civil Aeronautics Board interviewed Clyde as part of their final report. His testimony was summarized in a single paragraph that said the aircraft had received routine maintenance and was airworthy at the time of departure. No mention of emergency inspections or non-disclosure agreements. Clyde told friends the investigators had mischaracterized his statement. He tried to call them back, clarify his testimony. They told him the investigation was closed. The final cab report, released in June 1963, ran 47 pages. Conclusion: pilot Roger Hughes had become spatially disoriented in instrument meteorological conditions and had descended below the minimum safe altitude while believing he was maintaining proper clearance above terrain. Contributing factors included Hughes' limited experience with instrument flight and his decision to continue into deteriorating weather. The report recommended changes to pilot training requirements, but assigned no fault to the aircraft or any external factors. As far as the federal government was concerned, this was a tragic but straightforward case of human error. Most people accepted that explanation. Accidents happened. Small planes were dangerous. Pilots made mistakes. But families didn't accept it. Friends didn't accept it. And the people who understood how the music industry actually worked, who'd seen contracts designed to trap artists in permanent debt, who knew what happened to performers who tried to fight back against a system built to exploit them, those people looked at the pattern and saw something else entirely. The forensic details emerged slowly, buried in technical appendices that most journalists never bothered to read. Page 32 of the final Cabby report contained a single paragraph about the aircraft's altimeter, the instrument that tells a pilot how high they're flying. The examiner noted that the altimeter had been recovered from the wreckage and tested against known calibration standards. Results showed the instrument was reading approximately 500 feet higher than actual altitude, meaning if Randy Hughes thought he was flying at 3,000 feet, he was actually at 2,500. In the hills of central Tennessee, where terrain rises to 1,500 feet or more, that 500-foot error was the difference between safe passage and catastrophic impact. The report listed this as a contributing factor, but didn't explain how the altimeter became miscalibrated. Instruments drifted over time, lost accuracy, needed periodic adjustment. That was normal. But 500 feet of error was significant, the kind of discrepancy that should have been caught during pre-flight checks or previous flights. Randy had flown that same route dozens of times. Either the miscalibration happened suddenly, or he'd been flying with a faulty instrument for weeks without noticing. Neither explanation made sense to people who knew Randy. He was methodical about checking his instruments, kept detailed logs, caught small problems before they became big ones. Morris, the Cabby inspector, who'd examined the instrument panel at the crash site, Retired from federal service in 1967. Moved to Florida. Didn't talk much about his work, but in 1983, 20 years after Patsy's death, a journalism student named Rebecca tracked him down for a paper she was writing about aviation safety. Morris was 71 years old, sitting on his porch overlooking a canal, drinking coffee that had gone cold while he talked. He told Rebecca things he'd never put in official reports, said the altimeter bothered him, the way it had failed bothered him. Instruments usually degraded gradually. This one appeared to have failed suddenly and dramatically. Morris had recommended further analysis, wanted the instrument sent to the manufacturer for detailed examination. His supervisor overruled him, said the cause was already clear, pilot error, no need to spend more money on tests that wouldn't change the conclusion. "Did you think it was sabotage?" Rebecca asked. Morris took a long time to answer, watched a heron hunting in the canal. Finally said he didn't know what he thought, just knew the investigation had been rushed, closed before all questions were answered. He'd learned not to fight supervisors who'd already made up their minds. The recording of Randy's last radio transmission became another mystery that deepened rather than resolved. Air traffic control in Nashville had taped the communication, standard procedure for flight operations. The tape should have been preserved as evidence, should have been transcribed, analyzed, included in the investigation file. Instead, it disappeared. The controller who'd spoken to Randy, a man named Walter, told investigators he'd heard the tape immediately after the crash was discovered, played it back several times, trying to detect any sign of distress in Randy's voice. Heard nothing unusual. Randy sounded calm, professional, exactly like a pilot making a routine position report. Walter logged off his shift, left the tape in the control room as protocol required. When investigators arrived the next morning to collect evidence, the tape was gone. Walter filed a report about the missing tape. His supervisor filed a report. The reports went to the CAB, which noted the loss, but didn't investigate further. Tapes got misplaced sometimes in busy control towers. Unfortunate but not suspicious, except Pearl, a radio sonde operator who worked in the weather office adjacent to air traffic control, told a different story. She'd been in the control room that night, checking meteorological data for her own reports. Heard Walter play the tape, heard something Walter apparently missed or chose not to mention. Behind Randy's voice, underneath it, there was another sound. Pearl described it as interference, but not the normal static of radio transmission. More like another voice, very faint, speaking words she couldn't quite make out. She mentioned it to Walter. He played the segment again. They both heard it. Walter said he'd flag it for investigators. Pearl assumed he did. Never knew the tape disappeared until months later, when she read about the closed investigation. The phenomena that occurred after Patsy's death moved from the realm of investigation into something stranger. Multiple people reported hearing her voice in the Grand Ole Opry. Not recordings, not memory. Her actual voice speaking or singing in empty hallways, dressing rooms, the stage itself after everyone had gone home. A sound engineer named Travis was doing late-night equipment maintenance 4 months after the crash. Alone in the building, testing microphone lines, he heard someone singing Crazy in Patsy's distinctive voice coming from the main stage. Travis walked out to investigate. The stage was empty, dark except for emergency lights. He checked everywhere. Nobody in the building except him. Locked himself in his workroom, finished his tasks as quickly as possible, left. Never worked night shifts again. Travis had another story, one he told fewer people because it sounded impossible. He'd been archiving old recordings, transferring them to new tape stock to preserve them. Came across a performance Patsy had done in 1961. He'd recorded it himself, knew every note, had listened to it dozens of times. But this time, when he played it back, there were sounds that hadn't been there before, breathing in the wrong places, words slightly different, a quality to the vocal that seemed off, like someone imitating Patsy rather than Patsy herself. Travis checked his notes, confirmed this was the original tape, not a copy. He made a new transfer, listened again. The anomalies were still there. He filed the tape away, Didn't mention it to anyone except a few trusted friends who thought he'd been working too hard. Charlie Dick found the note in September, 6 months after Patsy died. He was going through her closet, finally bringing himself to sort her clothes, decide what to keep and what to donate. Behind a shoebox on the top shelf, folded into a small square, a piece of paper in Patsy's handwriting. The message was brief, undated, gave no context. If something happens, look at the contracts from 1960. Owen has copies he doesn't know I have. Follow the publishing companies. Charlie read it 3 times, didn't understand what it meant. Owen Bradley was Patsy's producer, the man who'd helped create her signature sound. Why would she hide a note about him? What contracts? What publishing companies? Charlie called Patsy's lawyer. The lawyer said he'd look into it. Weeks went by. The lawyer called back, said he'd reviewed everything he had access to, found nothing unusual. Charlie asked about the contracts from 1960 specifically. The lawyer said those records weren't in the files he'd received, possibly destroyed in the office burglary, possibly never filed properly to begin with. Dead end. A journalist named Ida May worked for the Nashville Globe, a small independent paper that covered stories the bigger outlets ignored. She'd been following the financial irregularities in Patsy's estate, talking to people like Lenora who'd fled the industry, piecing together a pattern of exploitation that extended beyond just one artist. Ida May wrote a comprehensive article detailing how record labels used complex contracts and shell publishing companies to siphon royalties away from performers. Named names, included documents, submitted it to her editor in August of 1963. The editor loved it. Said it would run as a front-page feature. 3 days before publication, the editor killed the story, told Ida May it needed more sourcing. She argued. He said the decision was final. Ida May quit, tried to pitch the story to other papers. Nobody would touch it. She kept the research in a file box in her closet for 20 years before donating it to the Tennessee State Library archives, where it sat mostly unread until researchers started looking into the early history of Nashville's music industry. The Civil Aeronautics Board closed its investigation in June of 1963 with a conclusion that satisfied nobody except the people who needed the case to go away. Pilot error due to spatial disorientation in instrument meteorological conditions. Randy Hughes had flown into terrain while believing he maintained safe altitude. The miscalibrated altimeter was noted as a contributing factor, but not examined beyond surface-level analysis. The missing radio tape was mentioned in a footnote. The emergency maintenance 2 days before departure was summarized in passive language that obscured more than it revealed. 47 pages of technical writing that created the appearance of thoroughness while avoiding the questions that actually mattered. Charlie Dick never accepted the official story, spent years writing letters to the CAB, to his congressional representatives, to anyone who might force a deeper investigation. Got polite responses that said nothing. The case was closed. Resources had to be allocated to current incidents. Historical accidents, however tragic, couldn't be relitigated indefinitely. Charlie kept Patsy's note about the 1960 contracts in his wallet, showed it to lawyers, accountants, journalists. Most people told him it probably referred to routine business disputes, nothing sinister, just the normal friction between artists and labels. A few people looked at the note and saw what Charlie saw, a woman who knew she was in danger, a woman leaving breadcrumbs in case something happened. The truth about Randy Hughes's pilot license emerged in 1977, 14 years after the crash, when a researcher named Thomas was compiling data on aviation safety for a Department of Transportation study. Thomas requested FAA records for all pilots involved in fatal accidents between 1955 and 1965. The files arrived in boxes that filled an entire office. Thomas spent months reviewing them, cataloging patterns, identifying systemic issues. When he got to Randy Hughes's file, he found something the original cab investigation had never mentioned. Hughes's license had been suspended twice before the fatal flight, once in 1961 for flying into restricted airspace, once in 1962 for operating an aircraft with expired registration, Both suspensions were temporary, lasting 30 days each. Both were resolved through administrative hearings that resulted in warnings, but no permanent revocation. The CAB report made no mention of this disciplinary history. Thomas published his findings in an academic journal that almost nobody read. A few aviation safety advocates cited his work. The mainstream press ignored it. By 1977, Patsy Cline had been dead longer than she'd been famous. The story was old. People had moved on. But the question Thomas raised remained unanswered. Why had Randy Hughes been in such a hurry that Sunday afternoon? He knew a storm was coming. Knew his license history made him vulnerable to additional scrutiny if anything went wrong. Knew he was carrying 3 passengers whose families depended on their safe arrival. What deadline was more important than all of that? 2003 marked the 40th anniversary of the crash. The Country Music Hall of Fame organized a memorial event. Journalists who covered music history wrote retrospective pieces about Patsy's influence, her 4-octave range, her ability to make even the simplest lyrics sound profound. Some of those journalists started digging into the old conspiracy theories, calling them conspiracy theories while simultaneously presenting evidence that suggested maybe they weren't entirely baseless. A writer named Margaret filed a Freedom of Information Act request for any FBI documents related to threats against country music performers in the early 1960s. She expected to get nothing. The FBI rarely acknowledged investigations that old and entertainment industry matters seemed unlikely to have warranted federal attention. 6 months later, Margaret received a response. The FBI did have files. Heavily redacted, full of blacked-out names and dates, but clearly indicating that between 1961 and 1964, federal agents had investigated multiple reports of intimidation and threats targeting Nashville recording artists. The files referenced labor disputes, the contract enforcement actions, and allegations of financial impropriety by industry executives. Specific names were redacted, specific incidents were redacted. But the files confirmed that something had been happening, something serious enough that the FBI opened investigations. Most of those investigations were closed without charges. The files gave no explanation why. Margaret published her findings on a music history website. The story got picked up by a few alternative press outlets. Mainstream media again ignored it. The narrative was too complicated, required too much context, implicated institutions that were still powerful. Easier to stick with the accepted version. Patsy Cline died in a tragic accident caused by pilot error and bad weather. A cautionary tale about the dangers of small aircraft and the importance of respecting weather conditions. Clean, simple, complete. But the families never stopped asking questions. Randy Dick Jr., who'd been 4 years old when his mother died, grew up with the official story ringing hollow in his ears. Spent decades collecting documents, interviewing witnesses, building a case that he knew would never be heard in any court. He wasn't trying to prove murder, wasn't claiming shadowy figures sabotaged the plane. He just wanted acknowledgement that the investigation had been inadequate, that questions remained unanswered, that his mother's death deserved more than a 47-page report that raised more issues than it resolved. Randy Jr. died in 2013, 50 years after the crash, still waiting for that acknowledgement. Camden, Tennessee remained a small town that most people passed through without stopping. The crash site, that wooded hillside where Wade Odell had found the first pieces of wreckage, became a place where fans made pilgrimages. Someone built a small memorial, just a simple stone marker with Patsy's name and the date. People left flowers, photographs, handwritten notes. Over the years, the memorial grew. More markers for Cowboy, Copas, Hawkshaw, Hawkins, Randy Hughes. Trees around the site had ribbons tied to their branches, faded by weather but regularly replaced. Local teenagers told stories about hearing music in those woods. Investigators called it auditory pareidolia, the brain creating familiar patterns from random noise. The kids who heard it knew what they'd heard. The clock metaphor became the lasting image. Patsy's watch stopped at 6:20 p.m., the moment of impact. frozen in time like everything else about that night. The unanswered questions, the missing evidence, the pattern of deaths that connected Buddy Holly to Eddie Cochran to Patsy Cline to Jim Reeves, the contracts that disappeared, the tape that vanished, the note hidden in a closet. All of it stopped at 6:20 p.m. on March 5th, 1963, and never moved forward, never resolved. Just suspended in the amber of official reports and fading memories, what remains now is the music. Crazy still plays on radios across America. I Fall to Pieces still makes people cry. Patsy's voice, captured on tape before the crash, before the mysteries, before any of this happened, continues reaching new generations who don't know about cab reports or missing evidence or FBI files. They just know a woman could sing in ways that seemed impossible. Could take heartbreak and turn it into something beautiful. That legacy proved impossible to erase, no matter how many documents disappeared, no matter how many investigations closed prematurely, no matter how many questions never got answered. The voice survived. Everything else is silence and speculation. And in Camden, on that hillside where the wreckage fell, the memorial clock remains forever stopped at 6:20, marking the moment when a queen fell from the sky and the truth fell with her.